A surgeon who had just saved the life of a United States senator was stopped by police outside the very hospital where the operation had taken place. In the eyes of the officer approaching him, his supposed crime consisted of nothing more than a hooded sweatshirt, an aging sedan, and his refusal to step away from a medical cooler containing donor heart tissue. Before long, the surgeon was on his knees in the rain, his hands locked behind his back while a small crowd gathered beneath umbrellas to watch. When the police chief arrived to verify the arrest, the surgeon spoke only 2 words. The chief's face turned pale. The entire scene fell into a silence that no one present would ever forget. The rain that autumn evening was thin and cold. It never became a true storm, but it never completely stopped either. A gray mist settled over the city, transforming every streetlight into a soft and blurred halo. Inside the hospital, machines beeped in steady rhythms. Nurses moved between rooms with practiced urgency, and somewhere beneath all that controlled activity, a man who had spent most of his life learning how to hold a human heart in his own hands was completing one of the most difficult shifts of his career. No one inside the hospital doubted his ability. Outside those walls, however, none of it would matter. Dr. Darius Whitaker emerged from an operating room late that evening. The collar of his surgical scrubs was damp and his hands trembled slightly after hours of uninterrupted concentration. Behind him, the surgical team continued performing final checks on a patient whose heart had stopped twice during the operation. Darius had brought it back both times. A junior resident quietly told him that no one else in the hospital could have closed the patient's chest and walked away with such calm confidence. Darius merely shrugged. To him, it was the work he had spent half his life training to perform. He had grown up in a modest apartment above a laundromat. His mother worked as a nursing assistant and regularly accepted double shifts to keep their electricity on and food on the table. Darius never forgot what it felt like to watch her come home exhausted and still find enough energy to check on a sick child living nearby before preparing dinner. That memory followed him through medical school, residency, and every long night that came afterward. It shaped him into a man who measured his value not by the degrees and titles following his name, but by the steadiness of his hands when another person's life depended upon them. His colleagues occasionally joked that he could have created a private medical practice worth millions. Darius always gave the same answer. A heart did not beat differently depending upon who was paying for the surgery. The hospital administrator offered him a company vehicle that evening. A black town car with dark windows and a professional driver waited near the entrance. It was the kind of transportation reserved for celebrated surgeons whose photographs appeared in donor newsletters. Darius declined, just as he always did. Instead, he walked toward a distant corner of the parking garage where his own vehicle waited beneath a flickering light. It was a sedan more than 2 decades old. Its once gray paint had faded to a dull and uneven color, and one hubcap had been missing since a winter he could barely remember. I had never found the time or motivation to replace it. Darius pulled a gray hooded sweatshirt over his surgical clothing. The autumn air had become cold, and after spending so long on his feet, comfort mattered far more than appearances. In his other hand, he carried a rigid medical cooler. Sensors lined its exterior, and a small digital display glowed with a steady green light. Inside rested a segment of donor heart tissue that had been transported from another state. It needed to reach a transplant facility across the city before it lost viability. The scheduled courier service had failed unexpectedly, and Darius had volunteered to deliver the tissue himself without hesitation. The transplant team waiting across the city had made the urgency clear. Any unnecessary delay could force the procedure to be postponed and place another patient's future in danger. Rain had begun falling in a fine mist when Darius left the garage. The streetlights blurred through the windshield as he drove carefully, with the cooler secured in the passenger seat like a second passenger whose safety mattered more than his own. He repeatedly calculated the fastest route while thinking only about the patient waiting at the destination. Darius did not notice the second pair of headlights behind him until flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror, painting the interior of the old sedan in alternating colors. His pulse tightened. It was not exactly fear. It was the sudden understanding that every moment of delay now mattered twice as much. He activated his signal and pulled toward the curb along the hospital's outer road. Then he reached toward the cooler to ensure that it remained stable. Darius had already begun preparing the calm explanation he would offer when the officer approached. Officer Bryce Dalton came toward the driver's side with his flashlight raised before his badge. The beam moved across the sedan's cracked windshield and settled on the hooded figure behind the wheel. Bryce struck the glass twice and ordered Darius to leave the vehicle immediately. His voice carried the clipped edge of someone who had already decided what kind of encounter this would become. Darius lowered the window slowly and kept both hands visible upon the steering wheel. In an even voice, he explained that he was a physician transporting time-sensitive donor heart tissue under an urgent medical deadline. Bryce looked beyond him toward the cooler. The container was sealed with tamper-resistant tape, and its display showed unfamiliar numbers. The officer demanded to know what was inside. When Darius explained that the cooler contained donor heart tissue intended for an emergency transplant, Bryce's expression became more suspicious. To him, the explanation sounded too detailed and too smoothly delivered to be true. Darius calmly offered to let him contact the hospital. He provided the direct extension for the transplant coordinator and offered to show the hospital identification badge clipped inside his sweatshirt. Bryce did not reach for the badge. I did not call the hospital. He did not even glance at the proof being offered. Instead, he repeated the order for Darius to leave the vehicle, this time more loudly. Darius hesitated for only a moment. I was not refusing to cooperate. I was concerned about leaving the cooler unattended while rain and cold air surrounded the open vehicle. Bryce interpreted that brief hesitation as defiance. His hand moved toward his belt. A young couple walking beneath a nearby awning slowed down. One of them lifted a phone and began recording, sensing that something had gone wrong even before fully understanding what was happening. Darius stepped from the sedan with both hands raised. The cooler remained balanced near the open door. He attempted once more to explain that a medical countdown was already running inside the sealed container. Bryce's partner, Officer Camille Reyes, stood several feet behind him. She watched the exchange with an expression suggesting that she understood the situation differently. Camille noticed the surgical scrub pants beneath Darius's sweatshirt. She noticed the hospital lanyard hanging from his neck. A small weight of doubt settled inside her. Bryce ordered Darius onto the ground. The surgeon politely asked whether he could first place the cooler safely upon the hood of the car. Bryce treated the request as another act of resistance. Within moments, Darius was lying face down upon the wet pavement. His cheek pressed against the cold asphalt while his hands were pulled behind him and secured with handcuffs. Rain fell steadily across the back of his neck. The gathering beneath the awning grew larger. Phones remained raised while voices murmured in confusion. No one stepped forward. Everyone was recording a moment they did not yet fully understand. Camille crouched beside the sedan and looked through the open passenger door. The cooler rested precariously upon the seat. Its indicator had changed from a steady green light to an amber warning that pulsed more quickly as time passed. Camille had responded to enough medical transport calls to recognize a temperature alert. Concern moved through her, although she remained silent while waiting to see how Bryce would respond. Still pressed against the pavement, Darius turned his head far enough to see the changing light. For the first time, urgency cracked through the calmness in his voice. Among the witnesses stood an older man who had once been one of Darius's patients. Hai was a heart attack survivor who recognized the surgeon's voice before clearly seeing his face through the rain. The man pushed forward and told everyone who would listen that the person on the ground had personally repaired his heart after he collapsed in a grocery store parking lot. He owed his life quite literally to the same hands now restrained behind Darius's back. The testimony did not immediately change Bryce's behavior. His attention remained fixed on procedure as he understood it, rather than the unease spreading through the crowd. But the older man's words strengthened the doubt already growing inside Camille. Videos of the arrest began circulating rapidly. They moved through personal messages and group conversations until strangers across the city were watching a black surgeon lying in handcuffs outside the hospital where he worked. Public opinion divided immediately. Some viewers insisted that the officer was simply performing his duty under uncertain circumstances. Others pointed toward Darius's surgical clothing, visible hospital badge, and calm, cooperative manner throughout the recording. When a supervisor asked about the detention over the radio, Bryce stated that he had followed procedure. He claimed Darius matched the description of a suspicious individual reportedly seen near the parking structure. Darius remained silent upon the ground. It was not because he had nothing left to say. I understood that any form of resistance, whether physical or verbal, could later be used against him. Camille returned to the open car door. This time, she carefully examined the label beneath the cooler's tamper tape. It displayed the hospital's official logo, the name of a transplant coordinator, and a barcode corresponding to a formal transport authorization. She held the label toward Bryce and quietly suggested that they verify the information before continuing. For a moment, his certainty weakened. Then he dismissed the paperwork and claimed that the label could have been forged. No one attempted to open the cooler. Some instinctive concern about contaminating medical material kept the officers from breaking the seal. The container remained on the wet seat while the people around it argued as though it were invisible. Its warning light continued blinking faster. Still restrained, Darius called out again. Hai explained that someone needed to contact the hospital's transplant department immediately. Every additional delay reduced the possibility of a successful operation for a patient he had never even met. Bryce ordered him to remain quiet. He reached for his radio, but the communication coming through it would do nothing to slow the encounter already moving beyond his control. Dispatch repeatedly attempted to contact the officers. An urgent message from the hospital's transplant department requested immediate confirmation regarding the courier's condition and location. Bryce heard the first transmission. Convinced that he already controlled a dangerous situation, he lowered the radio's volume and continued processing the man he had decided must be guilty of something. Camille heard the communication as well. This time, she refused to remain silent. She directly told Bryce that the hospital was calling about the same cooler sitting inside the detained man's car. The crowd had grown significantly larger. Phones were held high while people arriving from a nearby bus stop slowed down to watch a man in surgical clothing restrained beside a hospital vehicle. A nurse leaving her own shift recognized Darius. She gasped and began telling the people around her exactly who he was and what he had probably just finished doing inside the hospital. The information moved through the gathering like an electrical current. Confusion became outrage within moments. Still, Darius remained kneeling in the rain with his hands locked behind him. The sound of tires moving sharply across wet pavement finally disrupted the standoff. A dark SUV turned the corner and stopped suddenly near the scene. The driver's door opened before the vehicle had completely settled. A woman stepped out wearing a surgical blouse stained with drying blood along one sleeve. A hospital badge hung from a lanyard identical to the one clipped beneath Darius's sweatshirt. She moved through the crowd without hesitation. She ignored the phones recording her and focused entirely upon the kneeling surgeon and the officer standing over him. Her voice cut through the crowd with enough authority to make Bryce instinctively move backward. She demanded that the handcuffs be removed immediately. Then she asked what possible legal justification existed for detaining a physician upon hospital property while he was performing an urgent medical transport. Bryce responded with the same suspicion he had shown toward Darius. He asked who she believed she was to issue orders at his scene. Without raising her voice, the woman identified herself as Dr. Lenora Harrison, head of emergency medicine at the hospital directly behind them. She explained that the man on the ground operated under her medical authority in matters involving organ and tissue transportation. Bryce still refused to release the restraints. Some stubborn part of him could not admit before the growing crowd that the entire encounter might have been constructed upon a mistake. Camille had already begun reaching for her own handcuff key. She understood that Lenora's authority was not something they should continue challenging. In that suspended moment, while rain fell and dozens of strangers watched in near silence, Darius raised his head from the pavement. His eyes met Lenora's across the short distance separating them. He spoke only two words. They were quiet but unmistakably clear above the murmuring crowd. My wife. The words struck the scene like a stone falling into still water. Their meaning moved outward through the crowd across Camille's stunned face and Bryce's suddenly motionless posture. Then they reached this man who had just arrived at the edge of the gathering. His chief's badge caught the light from a nearby patrol car as he stepped from his vehicle. Chief Conrad Harrison had come personally because the report of an arrest involving a possible medical emergency had been marked as requiring senior attention. It was the kind of situation that needed to be controlled before it caused permanent damage to the department. He crossed the wet pavement with long and purposeful steps. After decades in law enforcement, Conrad was already preparing the calm and authoritative language he normally used to settle difficult scenes. Nothing had prepared him to find his own daughter standing above a handcuffed man, her surgical blouse still marked by the blood of a patient she had helped save. The words "my wife" reached him just before his eyes fully recognized the people involved. For a moment, Chief Harrison stood completely still in the rain. His mouth opened slightly while his mind refused to assemble the meaning of what he was seeing. Lenora had kept her family name after marriage. It was a deliberate decision intended to prevent even the smallest suggestion of favoritism within a hospital system where her father's position still carried influence among some administrators. She had told very few people about the marriage. Lenora wanted her career to rest entirely upon her own competence. She never imagined that the privacy she protected so carefully would one day collide with her father's badge upon a rain-covered street outside her emergency department. Conrad's gaze moved from his daughter toward the man kneeling beside her. He now understood that he had met Darius only a few times, during quiet family dinners where introductions had remained intentionally vague. He had never learned the man's complete name or profession. The truth reached him in fragments, with each realization heavier than the one before it. The surgeon his officers had forced onto the pavement was the same man who had sat across from him at his daughter's dinner table, quietly laughing over a story involving a difficult patient. The chief remained silent for several long moments. The quiet spread through the crowd until even the people holding phones understood that something far larger than an ordinary arrest was unfolding. Years on the police force had taught Conrad how to assess a scene quickly. He knew how to separate relevant facts from surrounding confusion and maintain a steady voice while events collapsed around him. None of that experience prepared him for the disorientation of seeing his daughter, blood still drying upon her sleeve, standing over a man who shared her home, family celebrations, and private life. Conrad suddenly remembered a dinner from years earlier. Darius had passed him a bowl of mashed potatoes across a crowded table. The chief wondered how he had failed to ask one meaningful question about the man seated before him. Lenora broke the silence. Her voice remained steady despite the emotion beneath it. She again ordered the officers to release her husband and demanded an explanation for what evidence had justified the detention. Chief Harrison turned toward Bryce. In a low voice, he asked what specific probable cause supported restraining a man who was visibly dressed as a medical professional and transporting a sealed hospital container. Bryce stumbled through an explanation involving a report of a suspicious vehicle and what he described as an uncooperative attitude. The words became less convincing with every sentence. Camille quietly gave the cooler's official transport label to the chief. The handcuffs were finally unlocked. Around them, the crowd began understanding who Darius Whitaker truly was. Recognition moved through the gathering like another current beneath the first. Someone wearing scrubs near the hospital entrance called out his name. Nurses, technicians, and other medical personnel quickly collected near the edge of the scene. Several became visibly emotional when they saw one of the hospital's most respected surgeons kneeling in the rain. Darius had served in the hospital's cardiac unit for many years. During that period, his transplant operations had been credited with saving more than 300 lives, a number the hospital repeated with quiet pride in its annual reports. Prestigious research hospitals throughout the country had attempted to recruit him. Their offers included signing bonuses large enough to purchase a home outright. Darius rejected everyone. He chose to remain at the public hospital where he had trained as a resident. National medical organizations had honored him more than once for innovations in transplant surgery. The plaques rested almost unnoticed upon a wall outside his office, where he rarely stopped to look at them. By every meaningful professional standard, Darius was one of the region's most accomplished cardiac transplant surgeons. That truth made the sight of him in handcuffs even more disturbing. The patient whose life Darius had saved earlier was a sitting senator whose representatives had specifically requested him after reviewing his transplant success rate. That detail would become public later, adding even greater seriousness to what had occurred outside the hospital. The cooler inside the sedan contained donor heart tissue, worth millions of dollars in research, transportation, and preservation costs. More importantly, it was intended for another transplant procedure that needed to begin urgently. Chief Harrison carefully removed the container from the vehicle. His hands were noticeably unsteady. The warning display blinked amber one final time and changed to a solid red. Camille immediately activated the camera attached to her uniform. She called for someone to bring a portable cooling system from the hospital. Her urgent tone finally communicated the true seriousness of the situation to everyone present. A technician rushed from the emergency entrance carrying a replacement container. The tissue was quickly transferred, stabilized, and carried inside under Lenora's direct supervision. Her medical training took control even as fear for her husband remained visible beneath her composure. Now free from the handcuffs, Darius rubbed his wrists once. He did not immediately follow the tissue into the hospital. His attention settled upon the small camera attached to Camille's uniform. It had recorded the encounter from the beginning. Camille offered to replay the footage immediately. Chief Harrison nodded, his jaw tightening as he prepared to see what his own department had done. The recording confirmed everything Darius had said. It captured his calm explanation concerning the medical transport, his repeated offers to provide identification, and his request for the officers to call the hospital before escalating the encounter. The video also documented Bryce's refusal to inspect the badge. It recorded him lowering the radio volume when dispatch attempted to relay the hospital's urgent calls. Most damaging of all, it showed his decision to restrain a cooperative physician rather than spend a brief moment confirming a claim that could have been verified through one telephone call. Bryce stood at the edge of the scene with his arms crossed. He continued insisting that the footage would demonstrate that he had followed department policy. According to him, a nervous man who initially hesitated to leave his vehicle near an almost empty parking structure provided reasonable grounds for caution. But members of the crowd watched portions of the video on nearby phones. The recording moved between nurses, technicians, and witnesses. Their confusion changed into anger now directed toward the officer rather than the man he had detained. Chief Harrison watched the department's credibility collapse in real time upon a public street. Then he made what he would later describe as both the easiest and most difficult decision of his career. He ordered an internal investigation to begin immediately, before either officer left the scene. Darius showed no desire for confrontation. He did not shout at Bryce or demand an apology from the chief. His mind had already moved beyond the humiliation, the rain, and the restraints. Only one question mattered. He asked Lenora whether enough time remained to complete the second transplant procedure. She checked the time and quickly calculated the remaining window. There was still a narrow opportunity, but they needed to move immediately. Darius was already walking toward the hospital before she finished speaking. The nurses stepped aside to let him pass. Several briefly touched his shoulder in a silent gesture of support that meant more to him than any spoken apology. Lenora moved beside him. She removed her stained surgical blouse while walking and called ahead for fresh scrubs to be prepared. Their surgical team was already gathering by the time they reached the elevator. Behind them, Chief Harrison remained in the rain beside his vehicle. He watched his daughter and the man he now fully understood to be his son-in-law disappear through the hospital's sliding doors. The weight of what he had witnessed settled across his shoulders. Inside another operating room, the transplant proceeded with a level of precision that revealed nothing about the chaos preceding it. Darius's hands remained as steady over the new patient's chest as they had been during the senator's surgery. Lenora stood beside him throughout the procedure. Her presence became a quiet anchor that neither mentioned aloud but both clearly depended upon. They worked together with the practiced rhythm of a partnership developed over years. When the final monitor displayed a strong and stable heartbeat, Darius finally released a complete breath. His shoulders lowered for the first time since he had been forced onto the wet pavement. By the time he left the operating room, footage of the arrest had already spread far beyond the people who witnessed it personally. A local news organization obtained the video after reporters arrived near the hospital entrance. The complete story, including the medical cooler, quickly moved from a local curiosity into an issue commanding attention across the city. Photographs showed Darius kneeling in handcuffs beside his faded sedan. Those images appeared beside older photographs of him receiving national awards for transplant surgery. The contrast between them provoked greater outrage than any written description could have achieved. News anchors read his professional history on the air. They spoke about the hundreds of lives saved through his hands. Viewers who had never met Darius became deeply affected by the story of a surgeon whose name they had not known before that night. Letters soon began arriving at the hospital. Some came from former patients thanking him again for surgeries performed years earlier. Others were written by strangers who simply wanted him to know they regretted what happened. Each letter became a small counterweight to the humiliation of that rainy evening. Darius read every message Lenora brought home. Nima no public response. Instead, he kept a small collection inside a drawer beside their bed. He once told Lenora that the letters were evidence that decency still outnumbered its opposite, even during the worst nights. At Chief Harrison's request, the hospital security department released complete and unedited exterior footage. The recording began when the police lights first appeared behind Darius's sedan. Viewers watched the encounter without commentary. They saw him repeatedly offer his hospital identification. They watched Bryce dismiss it each time. They saw the cooler's indicator change from green to amber and finally red, while arguments about suspicion and authority continued around it. Inside the medical community and far beyond it, Darius became a symbol of quiet dignity under pressure. His patience and calm insistence upon proper verification stood in sharp contrast to the treatment he endured. Bryce was placed on administrative leave while the investigation moved forward. The review ordered by Chief Harrison quickly expanded beyond the single encounter. Investigators examined years of previous complaints against Bryce. They discovered a pattern of similar stops disproportionately involving black residents wearing professional clothing or driving vehicles officers considered inconsistent with their appearance. Several cases had been quietly settled or dismissed without serious review. Chief Harrison personally examined those records. High was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth concerning how much his department had allowed to pass without examination. Questionable behavior had been hidden beneath routine paperwork and the automatic belief that officers always acted with honest intentions. One particular file stopped him. Years earlier, a school teacher had been stopped outside his apartment building while carrying a stack of graded examinations. An officer claimed the papers looked suspicious in the darkness. The complaint had been closed almost immediately and marked resolved without a single follow-up interview. The teacher's statement had simply been dismissed in favor of the officer's account. As Conrad reviewed that file beside several similar reports, he understood that the failure outside the hospital had not been an isolated mistake. It was the visible edge of conduct the department had quietly allowed for far too long. Chief Harrison held a public press conference outside the same hospital where Darius had been arrested. He avoided the cautious and defensive language often used during official apologies. He spoke Darius's name directly. Conrad acknowledged the specific failures of the officer involved and admitted that the department had allowed bias to replace basic verification procedures. A simple telephone call should have ended the encounter before it escalated. Darius stood nearby and listened without visible satisfaction or continuing anger. His attention frequently moved toward Lenora, whose hand rested gently against his arm throughout the statement. Mayor Everett Sloan had followed the growing public response with concern for both the city's reputation and the disturbing behavior revealed by the footage. He personally invited Darius to address a public forum. Darius considered the invitation carefully. He privately told Lenora that he had no interest in becoming a public symbol of outrage. If he appeared before cameras, he wanted to speak about something more useful than his personal anger. Lenora told him she trusted whatever he chose to say. She gently reminded him that very few people could have endured the incident with the composure he maintained from the beginning. The public forum filled beyond capacity. Additional chairs were arranged near the back, while many attendees remained standing near the entrance. The story had become something the entire city was discussing. Darius approached the microphone without written notes. He dressed simply, with his hospital badge still clipped to his jacket from habit rather than intention. The audience expected him to begin by describing the injustice committed against him. Instead, Darius spoke about the patient whose heart he had held in his hands. He described the second patient whose transplant nearly failed to happen. Hai explained how close the city had come to losing something far more important than his dignity because crucial moments had been wasted upon a rain-soaked street. Darius never mentioned his skin color during the address. He focused upon accountability, the importance of verification over assumption, and the reality that one simple phone call could have prevented everything. That call would have protected not only him and the waiting patient, but also the police department from the damage now spreading throughout the city. He spoke about responsibility. Every person holding authority carried a serious burden, whether that authority came from a badge or a surgical instrument. It could be misused whenever caution surrendered to certainty unsupported by evidence. Lenora stood near the rear of the stage. She watched him with an expression combining pride and relief. During the days following the arrest, she had often seen him sitting silently at their kitchen table. Hai was not exactly brooding. Hai was processing the experience with the same discipline he brought into every operating room. Early in their marriage, Darius had told her that surgery taught him an important lesson. Patience was not the absence of urgency. It was the mastery of urgency. Lenora now understood that he had applied the same principle to his anger, allowing it to settle instead of allowing it to control him. After the address, a reporter asked whether Darius had forgiven the officer who detained him. He considered the question before responding. Forgiveness, he said, was not the most important issue. Accountability mattered more. The city's responsibility was to ensure that no other person would ever need to answer the same question. Chief Harrison sat in the front row with his hands tightly folded. He listened to every word. When Darius finished speaking, Conrad was the first person to stand. The nod he offered carried more meaning than the applause filling the room. Later, away from the remaining reporters, Conrad quietly thanked Darius for the restraint he had shown. He admitted that he doubted his own composure would have survived the same circumstances. Darius replied that anger would not have delivered the donor tissue to the operating room any faster. During the incident, the only thing that mattered was the patient waiting on the other side of the deadline. The city introduced formal policy changes based directly upon the investigation. Officers were required to verify medical identification through direct hospital contact before escalating any encounter involving claimed emergency personnel or medical transports. Additional training became mandatory throughout the department. It focused upon reducing assumption-driven policing and improving de-escalation during situations involving emergency medical materials, professional identification, and unverified suspicions. Bryce faced formal disciplinary action after the internal investigation concluded. His case became a frequently discussed example in the new training required for other officers. Darius soon returned to his ordinary routine. He wore scrubs, performed operations, and continued parking the aging sedan in its usual corner of the hospital garage. The missing hubcap remained unreplaced. Darius never requested a newer vehicle. He again declined the black town car offered by the hospital out of a misplaced sense of obligation. The old sedan had carried him faithfully for decades. That was enough. Lenora continued leading the emergency department with the same quiet competence that had always defined her work. She became slightly less private about their marriage, although she remained fiercely protective of the professional reputation she had built independently. Later, after another long overnight shift, Darius and Lenora left the hospital together. The sky above the parking structure opened into pale golden light after days of rain. Darius unlocked the old sedan and held the passenger door for Lenora, not as a performance, but from habit. They entered the quiet street while the city slowly awakened around them. There had been no dramatic reversal of power and no public act of vengeance. There was only the slow return of respect that should never have been taken from Darius in the first place. It was restored not through retaliation, but through the simple and undeniable weight of the truth. As the sedan moved down the empty avenue, its engine produced the same familiar and imperfect rhythm. Morning light touched the faded gray paint and made it appear almost new for one brief moment. The car had never needed to prove anything. Neither had the badge clipped to Darius's jacket or the awards gathering dust outside his office. The truth existed in the lives he had spent his career saving, one steady hand at a time, long before anyone outside the hospital learned his name. The city continued moving around them. Buses departed from curbs, businesses raised their metal gates, and behind them, the hospital operated exactly as it always had, quietly and steadily, because people like Darius Whitaker returned every day. Regardless of what the outside world believed when it first looked at him, Lenora turned on the radio. The music remained low, little more than background sound beneath the engine. Neither spoke for a while. They rested within the kind of silence possible only between two people who trusted one another completely. Across the city, Chief Conrad Harrison sat inside his office, reviewing the final documents establishing the department's new policies. He signed his name beneath a requirement that officers verify facts before allowing assumptions to guide their actions. Conrad remembered his daughter's steady voice upon the rainy street. He remembered the two words that changed everything he understood about how easily a person's life could be judged before that person was truly seen. The sedan turned onto the road leading toward the modest home Darius and Lenora shared. Its old engine continued humming with the same imperfect reliability. It carried two people who had endured something neither would ever completely forget. There would be other shifts, emergencies, and exhausting mornings. But from that point forward, there would also be a small and permanent change in how the city attempted to look before it judged. During that quiet and ordinary drive home, beneath the gray light of a city finally clearing after days of rain, the truth settled in the way truth often did. Not with ceremony or noise, simply, steadily, and permanently.